Hello, my name is Paul Gilbert and I'm Professor of Clinical Psychology here in Derby, and I've been President of the Compassionate Mind Foundation for a while and studied compassion. And these are a series of talks really to help us think about what compassion is and how compassion can help us in these times of trauma and tragedy. So in this talk, I'm going to take you through some concepts of compassion, where compassion comes from and how it works in our brains. So in order to do that, I need to just show you some PowerPoints again. So I'm going to share my screen with you. There we go, like that, just like that. And just like that. And there we are. Okay, so let's have a look at the nature of compassion. And we talked a little bit about safe relating in our last talk, and how compassion can actually be a world changer. So one of the things that's quite important is, if we're to understand compassion and how it can guide us, we need to understand a little bit about how our bodies, minds, and brains work. And these are things we should be teaching our children, actually. Well, the first thing is to be aware that we are a species amongst many millions of other species that have existed on this planet. Tragically, 99% of them are extinct, and tsunamis and meteorites and climate change have been responsible for some, but viruses have also been responsible for some. So viruses are an extremely dangerous hazard on this planet, and viruses have been around for many millions of years, since life began, really. Sometimes viruses cause changes in DNA which have beneficial effects. They create mutations, but viruses are killers. And that has implications for recognizing that we really do need to ramp up our understanding of viruses and our medical research on preventing and healing viruses. So that's the first thing. We are part of the flow of life. We are biologically built. And because of that, this has implications. Excuse me. For example, it has implications for how we think about ourselves. So how many of us chose to have 2 arms and 2 legs? How many of us chose to have genes that would make us musical, like Mozart, or a good tennis player, or a mathematician, or a scientist like Einstein? How many chose to have a heart, kidneys, lungs, liver, and need to eat other life forms to survive? How many have to breathe in order to survive? Did we choose that? No. That's basically how we're built. And of course, it's the lungs that this virus goes after. Do we choose to be a man or a woman? I don't think so. How many of us chose to be born in the UK, Nigeria, or Alaska? Did you choose where you were going to be born? No. To have a brain that can feel anger, anxiety, joy, lust, and compassion. Now, this is an interesting one. How many of us chose to have a brain that to have all of these things? Well, nobody, but they're all in us. They're part of our programming. They're part of our DNA programming. That's why every human being all over the world has the capacities to experience this to some degree or other. How many of us chose to have a body that starts to grow hair in very strange places? And when we enter puberty, and then as we grow old, begins to decay and die. So nobody chose any of this. Nobody chose to be a life form that comes into existence and goes out of existence. And we have to come to terms with that, don't we? There is no avoiding that. And that's very important, because that has implications for how we think about ourselves. So remember, we have bodies and brains that have been built for us, not by us. It's not our fault they are the way they are. Okay? These are the 2 key themes in compassion. It's not our fault they are the way they are. But we have to take responsibility for ensuring that some of the dark sides of our minds, and we have many, many dark sides, as we'll see in another talk, don't come into the world. In other words, how we can live to be helpful, not harmful. And we're going to be looking at that in a moment. So just like these viruses, right, we didn't build them, we didn't create them, but it is our responsibility to do what we can to heal them. Okay, we didn't create it. So you didn't create your mind and all the stuff that goes on. You didn't create your body and all the stuff that goes on. Our job is to try to work out how it works, and then, as best we can, to steer the mind, to train the mind, to cultivate the mind in a way that's going to be helpful. And we'll see that, how important that is. So our brains became the way that they are because of evolution. And the other point that's really important is that the version that we are is also out of our control. For example, if I had been kidnapped as a 3-day-old baby into a violent drug gang, we now know that hostile environments, threatening environments, have an impact on the genes that get turned on and off. It's called the epigenetic profile. My epigenetic profile, genes that are turned on and off me, would be very different in that environment than in the environment I did grow up in. So this is very, very important. So I wouldn't have chosen all that. I wouldn't have chosen to be a violent drug gang criminal. This is what life patterned me to be. And this is a compassionate insight as well, that all of us are experiencing the effects of our programming. We're all running programs. It's just, do we understand what they are, and do we know how to rewrite them? That is the greatest challenge of humanity for the next centuries, actually. And any of you who have watched Westworld are sort of talking about these things in a science fiction-y sort of way. So if we're honest, we've all just found ourselves here. Nobody chose to be here. Nobody chose to be a man or a woman with a brain like this and a body like this, all trying to figure out how to be, to live, to be happy and not to suffer. That seems to be crucial. Now, another thing that's very important is to understand the basic structures of the mind. So there are 4 basic dimensions of how our minds work, and getting to understand how these work in you can be extremely useful. So the first one is our motives. And these motives are basically life tasks. So they're things like you have to survive, obviously. So you need to be able to pay attention to threats and avoid threats. You need to do that. You need to be able to find food. You need to be able to find shelter. You need to be able to form relationships with others of your own kind. You need to form sexual relationships so you can reproduce. You need to look after your kids. So these are all things that are guiding you through your life. And one of the processes is, of course, caring for others and competing with others. But you also have emotions. Now, emotions are very different to motives, because emotions come on and go off quite quickly. So if you think of anger or anxiety or lust or joy or whatever, these last for a short period of time, and they're usually triggered by things linked to your motives. So the stronger a motive, the stronger the emotion, okay? So for example, the more I want to make money, the stronger the drive and the emotions when I do, okay? The less I want to make money, the less interested I am in making money, then making money doesn't really turn me on, and not making money doesn't really upset me, okay? So, or take football, you know, the more you're interested in football, you love football, love it, love it, love it, the more your country is likely to win the World Cup, the more excited you get. And if your country does very badly, then you'll feel a bit upset about that. But if you don't care about football, then you don't have emotions. So emotions are very much linked to our motives. And then the third category are our competencies. And these are ways of doing things. So birds need wings to fly, and they need a brain that will navigate them. And we have a brain that's full of wonderful competencies, as we'll see in a moment, for reasoning and empathy and so forth. But do notice this point, that empathy is a competency, it's an ability, it's not a motive. And people make this error, I'm afraid, of assuming that empathy is the key. Empathy is important for compassion. You're likely to be much more wisely compassionate if you're empathic than if you're not. But you can use empathy for all kinds of motives. You can, manipulative people are often quite empathic. If you want to deceive somebody, you're more likely to be successful if you're empathic, okay? So just be aware that empathy is a competency that can be used for many different motives in many different ways, whereas compassion is a motive, it's a motive. But you may need all kinds of skills to affect it efficiently. And then the third dimension of human behavior is our behaviors, which are to do with activation and sometimes deactivation. In the case of compassion, there's two basic. We call them active, where you go out and do things for people, but also at times it's a soothing and slowing and calming. And we'll be looking at that a little later on. Now, each of these can have facilitators and inhibitors. And when we're developing compassion, it's going to be very important we understand both of these, okay? The things that facilitate compassion, make it more likely, and the things that make it less likely. And that's true for all of these aspects. There are things that will make your anger more likely and less likely. There are things that will make you more empathic and less empathic. Okay, so in all of the psychologies, then there's always facilitators and inhibitors. Okay, so that, if in a nutshell, in a couple of minutes, gives you a map of the mind. And once you've got your map of the mind, that gives you the stepping stones to begin to think about compassion using this map of the mind. Now let's look at how motives work, because motives are the crucial elements of the mind. They're the things we really do need to go after if we're going to change the world, because these motives are now regulated with very powerful brain systems and physiological systems that have been built in by evolution, by nature. So if you think about caring behavior, if you care for somebody, think about how you pay attention to them, how you speak to them, how you think about them, how your body and your brain is working when you're in a caring state of mind, what you're feeling about them, what you want to do for them. Now switch to being with a person that you want to compete with. Perhaps you don't like them that much. How are you paying attention to them? Maybe you don't know them. Maybe you want to get one over of them. Or maybe you just don't care as long as you get more than they get. So how are you paying attention? What are you thinking about? What do you think is going on in your brain and your body? Well, I can tell you a very different pattern of activity in your brain when you're competing than when you're caring. Your brain is organized completely differently when you're competing than when you're caring. Okay? And the things you want to do will be quite different. So if you see somebody in distress when you're caring for them, that's upsetting. But if you see somebody in distress when you're competing for them, or they're your enemy, that can actually make you quite pleased. So motivations are crucial. They're the crucial determinants of our minds. And that has lots of implications when we start to think about what motives do our environments, particularly neoliberalism and capitalism, stimulate in us. And I'm afraid they overly stimulate this competitive mind. And this competitive mind is a dangerous mind for all kinds of reasons. It also increases risks of things like depression, anxiety, narcissism, and so forth. But we will come to that. The first thing is to see the power of motives. So here it is again then. When you're in a caring mind, you're going for caring and sharing. Sharing is very common in a caring mind, whereas if you're competing mind, then you focus on controlling, gaining, and holding. And this is why the wealthy people in the world, they get their resources and they simply hold on to them. There's quite a lot of evidence now that as people become more wealthy, they become less generous. That doesn't mean to say there aren't very generous wealthy people, because there certainly are, but it's just to be aware that competitive psychology changes our orientation in our relationships to others. And the third dimension is the in-group, out-group process, which is also extremely important, because how we think about and respond to those we see as the out-group is very important, because human history is terrible. Tribalism is terrible. We have committed some absolute atrocities in the name of tribalism. So once again, we've got to be very careful about how we stimulate tribal psychology, in-group and out-group psychology, and things like patriotism and all of that stuff that's often sold to be good. There's always a dark side to it, unless we're careful, unless we're compassionate with it. Okay, so let's layer this up. Then one of the things that's important in science of the mind is we begin to layer the mind, or at least understand the different layers of the mind, so we can begin to make sense of how it all works. Now, in fact, the mind is created in a relatively simple way, from quite simple processes called algorithms. And algorithms are if A, do B. So take, for example, your air conditioner, central heating, could be the air conditioning, the central heating. If the temperature goes down to a certain level, then the heating comes on. And if the temperature goes above a certain level, the temperature goes off. That's an algorithm, if A, then B. So let's have a look and see that your mind has all of these algorithms that are biologically wired in because nature built them into you. You didn't build them, they've been built into you. So the first one would be, if you see a threat, like you're in the jungle and you hear the sound of a lion, so that's very clearly a threat. When your threat system is activated, your heart rate will immediately flush up, okay? You immediately get increase in heart rate, you get tense and anxious, and you'll want to run away. But you don't want to do that if you see food. If it's food, you're very hungry and you just come across some food, then you will start to pay attention to the food. You will slow down your activity. You'll move towards the food. You'll salivate. Stomach acids will go, and you'll eat. If, on the other hand, it's a more powerful other who's attacking you, some big giant person who's attacking you, then you might submit and try and avoid the aggression from that powerful others by submitting. And many, many animals engage in submissive behavior when they're threatened by more dominance, don't they? Again, that's wired in. You didn't design all that. That's wired in. And if it's a sexual opportunity, then of course you will engage in courting behavior, whatever, and you'll have all kinds of changes in your body. And it's quite important we don't get these mixed up. Otherwise, you end up with something like Hannibal Lecter or something like that, which wouldn't be very nice. So the key thing about that is that we have these algorithms are all linked into the brain. And the one that we're interested in, of course, and it is an algorithm, that's where it begins, is if, in this case, it's an infant, is distressed and needy, then you allocate attention and energy and activity to try to alleviate that distress. Okay, very simple algorithm. But what it means is if you layer it up, you could begin to make sense of what compassion is, okay, by getting the simple steps first. Now, there are two routes to that algorithm. One route is via attachment, and the other group is via affiliation. That is the way in which we evolved in hunter-gatherer societies to be highly focused on forming positive affiliative relationships, caring and sharing. In a hunter-gatherer 2 million year evolutionary history, caring and sharing was the way to live. Whereas competing and trying to get ahead of it, people would have got you kicked out the group and then you were pretty much done for. You were dead because we didn't survive on our own out in those wilds at that time. So this is all about, called the social brain, the importance of the social brain. People like Robin Dunbar has written some brilliant stuff on this. Okay, so then let's have a look at this algorithm for caring. So if the infant is distressed and needing, then act to alleviate or satisfy those needs. And this is the mother. Okay, here's the mother. She's sensitive to the suffering and the distress of her infant, and then acts to try to alleviate and prevent it. And that's that is the archetypal nature of maternal caring. That's the template for all subsequent caring, okay? And there's an array, a whole range of physiological systems that have been evolved within our brains and bodies to allow us to do exactly that. Our brain has abilities to allow us to be attentive to suffering and then be motivated to do something about it. Here's a crocodile. She hears the cries of her hatchling hatching out of the nest, and she'll carry them to the water because that moving to the water is the time that they're vulnerable to predators. After that, she has no further interest in caring for them. She doesn't take them for Sunday lunches or play school. I'm afraid they have to look after themselves for the rest of their lives. On the other hand, here in live birth, the mother will feed the infant for a period of time and stay close to the infant and protect the infant from dangers. This is true for nearly all mammals. Well, it is for all mammals, actually. We have this caring relationship where the mother spends a lot of time and attention on caring, rescuing, looking after the infant. And I like this one. This is lovely. I think this is a great picture. And of course, the same with humans. Now, the key thing to get across, therefore, is that when we think about caring behavior, it's not one thing. You know, mothers have to do, fathers quite often too, in fact, any caring agent may have to do lots of different things, right? So paying attention, feeding, providing various resources to the infant, protecting and rescuing them when they need to. Sometimes the infant will be cold and need thermal regulation, comforting and soothing if they're distressed, encouraging, and so forth. So sometimes birds, for example, will push their fledglings out of the nest in order to make them fly. Okay, so sometimes we need to encourage our offspring, don't we, to make them take risks so they will learn things. So lots and lots of different elements in caring behavior, and this is a key element to get across, that caring behavior is not one thing. And as I say, one of the other aspects of compassion is this rooted in this sense of joyfulness and need for interconnectedness, and the way in which interconnectedness actually regulates our bodies as well. It regulates our physiologies. The more interconnected we are, the better we feel. So I want to talk a little bit about the wisdom of compassion quite quickly, to help us think that, you know, compassion is different from straightforward caring. So one of the things that has happened to humans is that we, in the last 2 million years or less, have evolved very quickly. From an evolutionary point of view, it's a bit of a rust job, actually. Comes with a lot of problems, but we have evolved different types of intelligence. Now, one form is the ability for thinking and reasoning, and this is complicated, but it means we can think in terms of time. We can imagine what would happen tomorrow. We have metacognition. I can think about my thinking. I can imagine things like, if I say this to Jane, she might say that to Fred. Fred might say that to John, and so on and so on. So there are all kinds of ways in which we can think and have scientific view of the world. That's how we can put people on the mood. And there's a huge array of different aspects to that thinking: planning, attributing, systemic thinking. But we also have another form of intelligence that evolved, which is empathy. And animals have some degree of empathy, they certainly do, but human empathy is quite extraordinary. Our ability to take an interest in the minds of others, to be able to talk to people, express our emotions, talk about our emotions, ask questions about the minds of other people, take an interest in them, to understand that people do things because they're motivated to do things, to understand that people do things because of things that might have happened in their history, in their past, you know. This is extremely important. But notice that you can be good at one, but not the other. For example, you know, we have many brilliant scientists in the world who are on track for winning the Nobel Prize, but not all of them will be the most empathic of people, right? And we can have some brilliantly empathic people. I mean, they're just so sensitive and understanding and engaging, but they're never going to win a Nobel Prize, and they may never be able to play the piano like Mozart. Okay? So these are different types of intelligence. And then we have a third type of intelligence, which is this mindfulness, this awareness of being aware, consciousness of consciousness. And this, like the others, are game changers. This is a game changer because this does give us the ability to begin to think about, to have insight into the nature of our programming. We can begin to look back in on how nature has programmed my mind, how my life has programmed my mind, how nature has programmed my mind. And that is a game changer. That is almost a fundamental change in the nature of consciousness on this planet, right? And the question is, how do we use this capacity for observing ourselves and taking intentional actions wisely? So the other thing this does is it allows us to do things knowingly and on purpose, okay? So you'll never see a lion recognizing that it's overweight and it's just become very slow in its hunting, and therefore it needs to wake up early in the morning and go circuit training. I've never seen lions go circuit training. I don't know if you have, because they can't imagine doing that. They can't intentionally train. They can't do actions intentionally. Yes, they will stalk their prey, of course they will, but nothing like humans can. This amazing capacity for knowing intentionality. Now, this is very important because caring is one thing, and that's part of our mammalian heritage, but knowing intentionality and knowing awareness, that's a game changer. And that's the game changer that has made us capable of immense compassion. It's also made us capable of immense cruelty, but it's made us capable of immense compassion. And it's this wisdom of how we use our new brain competencies in the service of the motive of caring that then turns it into compassion. And that's why wisdom is such an important quality of compassion, excuse me, and that's why compassion is not just caring behavior. It is caring behavior, but it's this very special form of caring behavior. So there we have it then. This is what we showed you in the first talk. This compassion is this motivation, the sensitivity to suffering, just like in the mother, for example, to distress and suffering in self and others. And then there's this commitment that you're going to try and do something to prevent it, alleviate and prevent it. And that means then that you engage, you're going to engage with suffering, turn towards pain, turn towards danger. That requires courage, okay? Courage is central to compassion. If you haven't got courage, then it makes it very difficult. And this issue of dedicated wisdom, to use our minds to wisely work out what is the best thing to do, because sometimes, you know, we just simply don't know. We don't know what the best thing to do is. Like now with this virus, there's a lot of ideas about what the best thing to do is, but it's probably going to be in a year or 2 years' time when we look back and we'll see if we did indeed act wisely or not. So each of these, the development of courage and the development of wisdom, can be more difficult than it first seems. So this leads to a core identity, really, where we live to be helpful, not harmful. When you take a compassion orientation, this becomes your identity, because you become aware that you have a mind that can be pretty harmful. I mean, if you look at the last few thousand years of our Holocaust and Roman games and all of that, humans can be pretty bad. Okay, so we choose then to recognize it's not my fault. I don't blame myself for having a mind that can do bad things or get angry or whatever, but I do choose to try to understand my mind and to live to be helpful, not harmful. Okay, I'm trying to not let my programming run me. I'm going to try to work with my programming. We're all programmed. We just need to understand, can we get on top of our programming? And in order to do that, it's useful to have a mind that we have trained and a body that we have trained. We say, you know, it's a little bit like wanting to climb Mount Everest. You could learn all the rope skills that there is, all the climbing skills that there is, but if you're physically unfit and overweight, you're not going to make it. So in order for us to pursue the intention of compassion, which is to live to be helpful, not harmful, then we need to train our brains and we need to train our bodies to bring out those desires, those motives in us. Remember that compassion, like all other processes, is a flow. So just like I could be angry to you, you could be angry to me, I could be angry with myself, and so on. So with compassion, I could be compassionate to you, I can be open and responsive to the compassion from you, and I can be compassionate to myself. And all of these flows actually support each other to a degree. Now, we often find that people are pretty good at being compassionate to others on the whole, not the narcissists amongst us, I'm afraid, sorry, or the psychopaths. They're not very good at that. They're very good at self-compassion, by the way, but they're not so good at compassion for others. But also people who are vulnerable to depression tend to be not very good at accepting compassion. They don't trust it, or they feel they don't deserve it. So these flows, all of the flows, are really quite important when we come to cultivation, as we'll see. Now, finally, just to talk you through very briefly, to show you that compassion is not one thing, what are the skills and emotions our firefighter will be feeling? And what about our human rights activist, Martin Luther King, brilliant orator, a stimulating orator, fighting for human rights and human justice, right? But what motivates him will be different to the firefighter. What motivates, what emotions he feels, what skills he has will be different. What about our counselor who is trying to support maybe somebody who's depressed or has just heard about breast cancer or something like that? What skills do they need? What emotions is our counselor feeling? And the chances are they're quite different to our firefighter or our orator, our human rights activist, Martin Luther. And what about courage? Well, when we come to the medical, one of the key things in the medical sciences, of course, this is an example of the medical teams fighting Ebola, that many people who work to help save others, and that includes the people in our societies right now, they have to manage their own anxieties. And this crisis requires us to manage our own anxieties so that we can actually stay true to our intention, which is to be helpful to others, to live to be helpful, not harmful. And guess what? That takes us back into this idea of safe relating, because we're going to live to be helpful, not harmful. So that takes us back into safe relating. Excuse me, which I talked about on the first talk. So core is this wise courage, right? We don't just rush in to the Ebola situation. We do it in a wise way. We don't rush into this virus. We do it in a wise way. And it's the same when it comes to ourselves. You know, we have to be able to develop the courage to develop with our own fears and distress and stay true to our intention. And our intention is to live to help others, learn to be a benefit to others, live to be helpful, not harmful, because we realize that the way our brains and our bodies have been built, it's very easy for us to be selfish and greedy and angry and violent and aggressive and hostile and tribal. It's all in here. But we're not going to follow that program. We've decided the most important thing for us to do is not follow the program. We're going to start to rewrite our own programs. And that is a compassionate way to live, to rewrite your program. So here we are then. Compassion is not one thing, okay? It's based on a motive, and this motive is the desire and attention to be helpful, not harmful. And this motive is being sensitive to suffering and making a commitment to try and do something about it, to develop the courage to do that, and to develop the wisdom to do that, not just to rush in wildly, but really work out what is the best way to do this. And when we do that, we might have all kinds of emotions that are dependent upon the context. Okay, there's no one emotion associated with compassion. Our firefighter and our doctors might be very anxious and they're trying to control their anxiety in order to follow a compassionate behavior, whereas our fighters for human rights might be very angry, but they don't want to just think through anger and be angry all the time. They want to be calculating, they want to be clear, they want to be inspiring. And if we're working with somebody who's dying, we might feel sad. If we help people, we might feel joyful. And if we inadvertently, unintentionally hurt somebody, we might feel guilty. So the emotions are very dependent upon the context. The skills are very dependent on the context. And you can be good at one aspect of compassion, but not another aspect of compassion. And it's the same with our competencies, okay? We need the competencies to enable us to be courageous. And that will include things like being able to tolerate distress, being empathic, having ways of reasoning which do not overstimulate fear, do not create panic. Again, we come back to this idea of safe relating, but we create a sense of security between us, and then the behaviors will follow. So that's the end of my talk for today, of helping us think about what compassion is. It's a motive, but we can plot its layering up. It's linked to an algorithm. And then we can see that there's lots of different types of compassion, all dependent upon the context, different emotions, different qualities, different skills, different abilities. So once we get our mind around what compassion is and what it isn't, things like kindness and empathy and all these things, these are ways of being compassion. But this is what compassion is, this dedication to live to be helpful, not harmful. And that means that over the next course of months or years, we as a species begin to realize we're interdependent and we can learn to live for the benefit of others. And when we do that, and when we move away from that competitive motivation that the neoliberals have been stimulating in us for the past decades, when we live for others, we will discover fantastic, amazing abilities in the human spirit, extraordinary, as we are now seeing. We just got to create the context. We just need the politics to do it, and we can. Thank you.